February marks Safe Internet Day, and the day used to celebrate the positive steps we can take to ensure the internet is the safest place possible for children and young people, and to place a digital anchor in our calendars for us to pause and perhaps talk about what's happening out there online and collectively what more we can do. And that's just what we're here to talk today about. This initiative also forms a key strand of our recently launched Call It Out campaign, which aims to bring together industry leaders and stakeholders across the education, business, and not for profit sectors to promote online kindness and identify ways in which we can come together and tackle the growing issue of toxic behaviour online. There really couldn't be a more important time to look at how we can support learners and young people more generally to protect themselves when operating in an increasingly online world. In fact, the government recently announced the launch of a consultation into safeguarding in order to keep children safe in education. The review will look at changes that were introduced last year and how effective they've been. So in essence, we want to help promote safer and more responsible use of online technology. My name is James Lane. I'm NCFE's Sector Manager for Digital, Creative and Design. I look at initiatives just like this to ensure that NCFE is well aligned to use our voice within sectors I represent to bring positive change to conversations and activities just like this. Today, I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Janet King as the Sector Manager for Education and Childcare, representing those key sectors and championing them within the organisation and throughout those same sectors. Janet brings, amongst many others, a perspective on safeguarding that will be key. And Richard Grant is the Information Security Manager, who is responsible for protecting our very own organisation from the myriad of threats, including attacks and other online issues. And it's those proactive and practical elements that we can look to explore today. So first, let me maybe just set the context. A very broad question. How big of an issue is this, Janet?
Thank you. Thank you, James. I think it's an increasingly big issue because technology is evolving all the time. And I think it's about keeping up to date with that and keeping up to date with the dangers that are there, whilst also accepting and appreciating that balance between digital learning and digital rights and access to technology that children and young people absolutely must have, but about keeping up to date with those dangers and being one step ahead. And that's difficult for staff in education when they're not actually working in this environment, but they're actually being responsible for it. So I think it's something that is always ahead of us. It's always in front of us. So it's a very difficult thing to actually control because you're either behind it or you're in it. So it's about balancing that. So I would say a lot of this and a lot of what I'll talk about in this webinar is probably around the training, around recognition of when things are going wrong, being able to recognise those signs from a safeguarding child protection perspective, and also about informing children and young people to be able to recognise those dangers themselves and to be able to know what to do when they recognise things like that.
Okay, so is an element of this to do with the pace of how technology is advancing? And then is that your point, that people are struggling to stay up to date with that?
I think so, because I have to put myself into those shoes. So if I was teaching, if I was in that classroom environment, and indeed as a member of a digital world, then I know what I know. I don't know what's going on around me, and I'm not in control of that. And that can often feel very chaotic. And we've got children and young people who are being exposed to technology that's beyond their knowledge, beyond their control. And it's about knowing what's okay here, what's not okay, whilst having that balance of let's enjoy and embrace this digital world and all the advancement that that can bring. So yeah, keeping in touch with things, trying to be in control of something that's ever moving. Is that possible? I don't know. But knowing what to do and where those dangers are, and absolutely at that fast pace. When we look at where we've come in 10 years, it's just incredible. So, being mindful of that. And I think it's come more and more to light with the blended learning that's become more and more of a necessity in education of late. Parents are becoming more informed. Teachers are becoming more informed and knowledgeable. But children and young people, and they will lean on teachers, quite rightly so, for that guidance. And then we've got the government guidance, as you alluded to in that introduction, that is changing. That's looking, keeping children safe in education is up for that review. but it's about that sense of, am I okay with this? And I think staff need to say, I'm not okay with this. What's going on? What do I need to do? Where's the training? And children and young people need to be as informed as they possibly can be in that fast-pacing world.
Okay, so just picking up on pace, I want to bring Richard in. I suppose my question to you, are we a victim of our own success as we're driving technology forward? Have we struggled as people to keep up? Is that part of the problem?
I definitely feel there is an element to that, and I think one of the kind of major things that we take for granted is the incredible power of having access to the internet and the digital world, and that has changed the way that we interact and the way that we utilize those resources, and that's the kind of balance to strike in that there's a whole host and raft of information and means to communicate and interact with each other that we never really had, though, as much as 10, 20 years ago. And particularly the ways that we're doing those interactions on the internet is evolving at a rapid pace as well. And I think that's part of the difficulty and the challenges that we all face, because looking at it from a human and biological perspective, we're quite slow in the way that we adapt and work. So I think the rapid pace of that evolution with technology does mean that there are challenges in keeping up with it. Despite me being involved in information security and needing to understand how all these things work, even for me, the rapid pace of that technology is well beyond what I can keep up with. I can't possibly know about every single development and understand it fully, at least to the extent that you can feel truly comfortable, that you have that confidence and power to properly understand how it all works.
Absolutely. So I suppose what I want to get into, and this is maybe an open question for both of you, is this a human behavior issue, or is it an issue with the technology, or is it sit a foot in both camps? Well, I'll open up. There we go, Janet.
It's very, very
And
interesting.
that's a huge question, right? So I appreciate that. What I'm looking for is your thoughts, and I don't, we're not necessarily looking to solve the world's problems here.
I don't necessarily think it's a problem with technology. I think technology is evolving all the time, but what we've then got to think about is that the positive and the safe environment that we can create with that evolving technology to make sure children feel safe. Because I think when we're in that, when we're using the technology, we're almost already behind the innovation of where technology is. So I know we're going back to the pace there. I don't think, is it a human behavior issue? I think the freedom that technology gives to children and young people to express themselves, to be innovative, to create, all of that has got such huge potential. And I think and it takes boundaries away where there've been boundaries perhaps before. So this is difficult. And it's about not taking away those digital rights. I'm going back to that balance again. You've got to give children their digital rights, absolutely, but at the same time you've got to be aware of how these things are being filtered, how they're being monitored. How are we looking after these children, so that the information is well informed and the decisions are taken in a serious way, because it doesn't feel like educational learning. It feels different for children and young people because of that freedom and because of that control. So it's probably a bit of both from me, because we have to be mindful of both perspectives, I think.
That's fair. I think I see technology as maybe being this amazing tool, or has the potential, maybe clarify, to be this amazing tool, and it can in certain contexts. So if we just focus down into something specific like cyberbullying, and maybe allocate that to something like social media, Janet, you touched on the sort of the concept of it breaks down barriers, and it allows someone to say something online that they perhaps wouldn't say in person, and so that's that kind of human behavior coupled with technology. So maybe from a practicality perspective, Richard, what can we do? What are we doing? And I say we, the sector, the technology sector, right? What are we doing to stop that from being such an open conduit then?
So just before I answer that question, because it's a good question, I think there's there's definitely a lot of things that are available and what we can do. I think one of the things I want to touch on first is around like the reasoning as to why that's kind of happening as well, because I think that's quite a useful thing to understand in order to be able to look then at what we can do around those things. So I think part of the reason, that there is this increased prevalence of that kind of abuse, because that's effectively what it is, particularly in an online space, is because the kind of audience that's available has grown rapidly, because like you say, the barriers have come down, and now there's the ability for people all over the world to interact, whereas generally before there was a bit more constraint there. But there's also that element of anonymity, that wasn't possible, or at least not to the same extent, when you're interacting with people face to face. And there's also an element of lack of repercussions in those actions, or at least immediate ones. So, there's that element of like, you wouldn't say something to someone's face because you know how they would react or how they would feel about it, and that is divorced somewhat when you have that online interaction, particularly in like a social media space, because you can leave a comment that can then be read later on by someone, and there's that kind of lack of immediate interaction there. So I think there is an element with the technologies and with, say, social media, if we use that as a single example, in having safeguards, having technical controls in place for people to be able to control that interaction, to allow them to foster positive interactions, be it hiding or blocking content or people that do regularly interact, and ensuring the enforcement of those terms of service that are drawn up by those organizations as well. And I think that kind of moderation aspect of content is very difficult to achieve because of the scale, and then the level of interaction that takes place is very hard for the people to kind of moderate and contain at the rate at which all of that interaction is taking place. And the automated systems we have are just imperfect, and I don't think they ever will reach a point where they can be perfect to try and control against those things. It's very, I suppose the other element is it's very difficult to truly understand intent as well, because you don't have those other cues that you might have in social interactions, be it facial expressions, tone of voice, those other elements that aren't necessarily obvious in, for example, a text-based social media platform like Twitter, for example.
Absolutely. Funny, I put a call out on social media about a week ago in preparation for this, and I asked if anyone out there was essentially an ex-troll that would be happy to talk to me. And to my surprise, a couple of people actually were willing to talk to me about this. And in essence, I had this one question, and it was focused around the why that you've mentioned. Why do you do it? Now, a lot of the conversation then focused around. And I'm largely paraphrasing, but essentially humor. I do it because it's funny, and I should, for clarity, point out that's their perception. And a lot of it then sort of spun off as we start to delve into a little bit more detail around I do it because I can, and I think that touches on some of those elements you just really well sort of brought out to the forefront. There is the sort of the lack of repercussion, the anonymity. I do it because I can get away with it, and to use your point, I remember maybe worryingly long ago when I was at school that this kind of notion of if someone shouted something at you, often the response might be come over here and say that. And to take that as a metaphor, it's kind of like, would you say it to my face? Would you say that if I was close enough to tell you off? Let's say that. And in the digital space, be it on any social platform or any digital platform, it is that creates that distance. So it's kind of, for me, it's on one side it's and again, largely paraphrasing, but I can get away with it, as in there's no repercussion to this. And then it's that digital step, that that report button, and are those systems working well enough? It sounds like not. You described them as imperfect. I think that's fair. It's a step in the right direction. I think we have seen an evolution in those kind of reporting functions and their prevalence maybe across different platforms. We've got everything from examples like from gaming to chat, streaming services, video, And Janet mentioned about the reshaping of learning experiences, right? And for the last couple of years, I don't know if you've noticed, there's been a pandemic going on. You may have heard about it, but it's largely,
really? Oh, okay.
yes, it has, yeah. But it's made a huge impact and change and shift and pivot and all those great buzzwords around how we do what we do, and not just we here at NCFE, but society. And so they've all changed, but we've been forced, we've reacted to a situation where now people need to be online to do things that previously weren't necessarily online activities. And so, when we take a look at those, everything from online learning, and I appreciate that's largely within an education environment and maybe a little bit different, but when we look at something like social media, I see that as potentially, like I mentioned before, a tool for good, a platform for great benefit. So what is it that's stopping that from being that positive space that maybe dreamers like myself would like to see it as?
What's stopping it being that? I think that's happening. I don't think that's something that's being prevented, but I think there are challenges in that. And I think where you are mixing technology with people, you are somehow, it's difficult with it when you're working with people, I think, and especially young people, because they are using something that they are not perhaps so familiar with. They're working with people who might not be that familiar with it as well. It's not necessarily habitual. They feel invisible, to the points that you've just been discussing. So I think creating a safe environment when people themselves aren't sure what kind of environment they're in is the first problem, or the first concern. And in lots of ways, coming from an educational background and bringing that perspective in, the blended learning and the fact that, all of this now is very formal, all of this now is becoming quite habitual in the way that we're learning, is actually, I think, creating a safer space, because it's becoming, this is how I learn now. It's not just how I play. It's not what's going on in a different world. This is part of my daily educational business now. And I think that might help in a strange sort of way, in my opinion, because I think it's channeling things that are sort of going on, all over the place without being measured and monitored, as Richard was talking about there, because it's difficult for parents to monitor. It's difficult for parents and teenagers to find some ease of working together where that is happening in a good way. It's difficult. It's difficult at school. You can't watch people 24/7. It's difficult. So I think having the sort of, we trust you now, you're using online, and you know what, it's part of your normal daily learning, it's part of your lessons. I think it might help. I think it might help as well if we created communities amongst children and young people where they themselves are becoming more in control of it, where they are becoming more informed and more aware of the consequences. Richard was talking about, and yourself, James, there, you talk about what previous people had said about why they did it. Well, the only way to make a difference there is for the people who are involved there to say, don't do this because this might happen, and how, and the pastoral side of how it makes people feel when those sorts of things are happening. So we do lots of role play and things like that in an education, and I'm sorry, I'm always going to bring it back to education, but we do lots of things like that bring in that pastoral side. How much of that do we relate to the world of technology, I would question. And I think there's opportunities to do that in terms of future careers. I sat on a board of governors in a local primary school, for example, true story, and we were able to actually say, was this you? And things that are actually being used, I think, oh yeah, that is me. I did that. These things that happen now have got consequences, and I don't think children and young people realize that. And so bringing that out in a safe space is something that's important, and recognizing the dangers, the harassment, the grooming, everything that is possible online, in and outside of school, but bringing that, knowing what to do and who to go to, and it being a safe space is the only way. But children and young people need to take control of the thing they want control of to a certain extent.
So there's an educational component to helping young people as we move more towards a digital society, move more online. We've got to make sure that young people are aware of the dangers, and you mentioned a couple of really good examples there. So thinking maybe specifically about teachers, so what can teachers and similar, where are their duties? What can they do to ensure that the people in their care are safe online?
Okay, well, training, I know we talked about it right at the beginning, but I think it's so important. So having a really strong induction where there is a good understanding and grasp of policy, not just there is a policy, oh, I'm going to go into an IT lesson, I'm going to have a quick look at it, or I'll look at it on my way out. People need to take it seriously, so you wouldn't pretend, or you shouldn't pretend, to teach a history lesson without having some background. Let's make sure that training is there. Let's make sure that's cascaded. And part of the Keeping Children Safe in Education, the consultation that's out at the moment, that is part and parcel of that, and getting that training right. But also designated safeguarding leads. This is part of this role and responsibility, and it really needs to be. So making sure that training is frequent, making sure that it's relevant, making sure you're aware of, how old are the children that I'm working with? What kind of stage in their development are we thinking about? How frequent are these children going online? And of course, education that is informing children and young people, but also each other in terms of staff and knowing what to do, and parents and carers as well. Somebody said to me, a colleague, somebody I used to work with in a school, and she said, parents are phoning me up, Janet. The students are not coming online for their lessons because this was during the dreaded pandemic, and I know we're almost still there. But when it was complete lockdown, and they're online all evening, all night, it's going to be absolutely horrendous in the family home if I interrupt that, and then the students aren't joining their online lessons. This has got to stop. So how frequent, but actually educating each other, and maybe having some peer communities. That's what I'd like to see. Peer communities where technology is being explored by the children and young people themselves, as to no boundaries, what's happening, that doesn't feel right, let's do something about it. And I think that is one way of actually bringing forward a bit of a cultural shift in terms of technology allows us to do, as in children and young people, well, okay, well, let's put some boundaries in. Where do you not go, and where can you? People, they don't know what's illegal and what's not, and in terms of, I'm sending that because I think it's funny, or I think I'll get a laugh out of that. The consequences of sending something like that to something that's totally abusive, it absolutely massive. And I think people think they're invisible, and they think it's not really them that's doing it because they're not face to face. The realities need to be out there. They need to be discussed, and people need to they need to acknowledge that. So designated safeguarding needs, absolute responsibility needs to be taken seriously. It's a serious issue. Digital skill and technology is a marvelous thing. How can we make this work? And I think children and young people need to have a degree of control in that. They can put their boundaries in and not lose that freedom and richness of innovation.
Okay. Now, Richard, taking that same theme and maybe looking at almost a proactive restriction, I suppose, for want of a better word, because Janet's done wonderfully talking around this sort of holistic care of educating, helping people understand what's illegal, what's not illegal. What can we do from a software, from a hardware perspective, to simply stop it happening in the first place? And should we? Maybe is just as big of a question.
And I think that's the difficulty, is like there are going to be almost societal questions about whether we should have that level of control. And I think what we should be attempting to do first is make it a more of a cultural endeavor, as in we make people want to act in the right way, be positive in their interactions, as opposed to attempt these technological restrictions. because that just ensures like that smoother interaction. However, that doesn't mean to say that it's not possible to have those technological restrictions in place. And they can be very wide-ranging in terms of how they operate, from some things that are very strict, such as complete blocks of access of those, bits of software or social media sites or whatever, it happens to be, age checks and things like that take place, which a lot of sites do attempt to do, but it's generally just put in your date of birth. And, if you wanted to, I'm pretty sure you could come up with a date of birth that's not accurate that allows you to bypass those kind of checks. And this is why like a lot of these technological solutions are generally imperfect, and that's why I think there needs to be an element of that as well. All the way through to like actual moderation of all content. So whenever anyone tries to publish a comment or something like that, it has to be approved by a second person to agree that that's an acceptable thing to post in the first place. So there are a number of other like options and things that are being kind of looked into and kind of already being adopted as and where possible. But it does come down to, even if you're trying to use things like AI, which is obviously a very big and growing area of interest for people, is to ensure that AI is trained in the appropriate way so that it is acting in the correct interest for people, and it doesn't end up going down the wrong path, which is kind of what can happen if the training data given to neural networks and machine learning is bad to start with. And I think that's part of the reason why those things haven't become as prevalent yet as we might expect them to be longer term. So I think that's part of the challenge to face there, and it's only going to get worse as well. I don't want to turn this into a very negative spin or a downward trajectory, but if we look at over the last, say, 10, 15 years, the way people interacted online was primarily through text. You would write messages. There would be these things called bulletin boards or forums, which are the things I used to frequent when I was young. And then your posts would be done that way. We look at over the last 5 years or so, then things have moved towards things like Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. So there's more picture-based interactions, and to some extent videos with things like TikTok nowadays as well. And then looking into the future, we're looking at VR and AR interactions. So these are now more, I'd say, immersive interactions, because you are embodying something. And this is also, I guess, through gaming is a similar kind of concept, in which you have like an avatar that you can then interact with. And those things require more and more complex technological solutions to, effectively control those in a way that's not just outright banning something or stopping someone from being able to utilize those services. And I think that's part of the difficulty that we're going to face if we're trying to toe the line where it's not necessarily outright stopping people from doing stuff, which can be quite damaging, because those interactions are important and are becoming more and more the norm, but not doing so in such a way that it is harmful to the people who are using it in the right way.
Absolutely. I love that concept of you touched on AI and then the programming even of AI. So let's ask Janet to put her safeguarding hat on. Imagine you're programming, and not literally, don't panic. Imagine you're programming this AI. What are the key things to watch out for? If we're maybe we're a teacher, for example, and we're trying to identify those signals, those red flags, because I agree with everything Richard just said, right? And particularly when we're looking at AI or any kind of automation, any kind of, even if we're just looking at it as a person, it can be very difficult to spot those behaviors, right? And you mentioned about the legality of things. Sometimes something can be difficult to spot because a behavior in a different context might be okay, but when young people, it's not okay, and that's a difficult thing to always spot. So from a safeguarding perspective, and I appreciate this is a huge question,
Okay.
what are the red flags? What are we looking for?
Okay, so from a teacher's perspective, in terms of being able to recognise when things are not okay, is really about tuning in to each child, each young person that you're working with. that is the bottom line in anything, for any teacher's life. I think if you're not tuned in to each individual person that you're working with, then you're not going to spot things, and you're not going to know, and things will be in a state of escalation before you do. So it's about recognizing changes in children's demeanor, recognizing changes in their approach to learning, things that are different, things that might be being said, things in peer groups, looking at friendship groups. I mean, is this the sort of thing, James, that you meant in terms of things to look out for?
Yeah.
So looking at things like that, and looking at attendance, absenteeism, and changes just in the way that they are generally behaving. And that could be a form of aggression that you see, or it could be a withdrawal from their peers. And also maybe looking at the language. Language is a powerful tool. So the way that they communicate with their peers as well, and with you, and just literally watching, observing, tuning in. A good teacher will know each and every individual pupil, and they'll know, oh, I'll just keep my eye on what's going on there, and they will monitor. And also about making sure that within peer groups and within lessons and within that, going back to that pastoral side of things, that this is not shied away from. This is something that actually needs to be discussed. What does it look like? What does grooming look like? What's the prevent duty all about? What does exploitation look like? Because if it's not recognised by young people, and why should they recognise it if something is being made in a world that appeals? Why would they recognise that as being wrong? It feels good. Why is it wrong? So there's much to do, I think, in terms of widening that understanding, but communication, and tuning in, observational skills, knowing those children and young people incredibly well, is key to most of this. And also looking at maybe changes in family dynamics. There's lots of reasons why things go wrong in people's lives. So I think it's just about having those conversations and knowing what conversations you can have and what the boundaries are there as well, and your networks of support and so on. But the ultimate thing is, if something feels like it's, and it's making a child and young person feel good about themselves, why should they think that that's wrong? So they need to know. And if it's making somebody, especially a young person, if it's helping them fit in some way, shape or form, why is it wrong to do that? And the idea that actually, well, by doing that, you may well be excluding and putting somebody else in real danger. Those things need to be explored so that people are openly making a decision not to go down that road.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to grooming, for example, then if it didn't make the young person feel good, then it wouldn't work. That's the whole problem,
Exactly.
right? So it's spotting the negativity of a perceived positive behavior. I think I've said that right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's a difficult thing. I love the way that you're essentially describing looking for patterns. I think you're more of a programmer than you think you are. Don't know. But
I'll take that.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. So maybe sort of sliding to Richard with the same kind of question. We've heard from Janet about how to spot those behaviors and those patterns within changes in behavior, and we looked at the grooming, which is again that sort of perceived positive, as in they're making the child feel good and getting them to change their behavior. We can look at the bullying, the harassment side of things, which is ostensibly more of a negative perception again, but we're still looking for behaviors. But from a technology perspective, what might those behaviors look like online?
Yeah, and they can be very wide ranging, and that's part of the challenge for people, because sometimes it's hard to identify those things necessarily as being very negative behaviors. You've kind of touched on this before, in some of the conversations we've had around, like, people troll because they think it's funny and they think they're having a joke. So to them, they may not even see it, like people enacting these negative interactions may not even see it as a negative thing. So there's that element of people being able to kind of really understand what they're doing and what impact it has on the person that they're interacting with. there's kind of this age-old statement, which is to not feed the trolls. That's always been one of the key tenets of people who operate online, which is to basically say, like, if someone is outwardly attempting to make your experience online miserable, shall we say, as a blanket statement, then the best thing to do is just not engage with it at all. Which is admittedly easier to say, than necessarily do, particularly on the type of interaction that's taking place. So I'll again use gaming as an example because it's a very interactive medium and it's very immediate in terms of what happens there. But there's concepts of trolling on games, and also known as griefing, where someone will be deliberately trying to negatively impact someone's experience of that game, and that can be very hard to deal with and address because, for example, you don't have necessarily control over that experience in the here and now. All you can really do is take yourself away from it, which again is a negative outcome. So some providers have tried to provide means to report those users that are disruptive or that are engaging in negative behavior. But then there's that time lag between you doing that action and then them actually being or potentially being impacted by that problem as well. So I think that's one of the areas that would need addressing, as well as to be a shorter period of time between those two actions taking place. Conversely, there's the action of, for example, in social media circles where people can block those problematic users, which does have that immediate effect because they then no longer can have that interaction as well. So it's kind of identifying what tools are available to you depending on the platform that you're in, and then making use of those tools. And that's, I think, something that a lot of people don't consider when they first sign up to these social media sites or these various other things where they can interact together. It's always very much an idea in the back of their mind, is that I want to use TikTok, for example, because I want to get 1 million viewers or whatever. That might be their driving interaction, or the thing that they actually really want to do. And that, I think, that comes from both a design perspective in terms of the people creating these platforms, is that the safeguarding element is almost secondary, or can be quite secondary, and the primary motivator is that engagement aspect. And there's that element of any engagement can be seen as a positive engagement for those platform holders. And I think there needs to be a conversation as well around, like, almost reshaping that and reframing it as that's not good and that's not something we should be kind of pushing for as well. So I think there's a lot of onus on all the different people within that, both the platform holders, the people who are using the platform, and also, as Janet alluded to there, like the guardians, the teachers, and the other kind of carers, that they need to be empowered and understand the kind of obligations there as well.
Absolutely, and I love that point. It essentially, algorithmically, then any interaction is a good interaction, and we've seen that prevalent within changes within search engine to sort of what kind of content should be put on websites. And you're absolutely right, it's prevalent within social media, that the sort of concept that you can say something controversial just to get interaction is perhaps ironically, digital companies are actually trolling its own audience in order to create this environment, right? I go to TikTok and I make a video saying the earth is flat, and I can guarantee you I'll get a lot of interaction within the first couple of hours on both sides, and maybe that's part of the issue. And I also love the gamification element of it as well, which is perhaps slightly ironic, because in many games that you describe is one element, and yet life is ostensibly not a zero-sum game. Right, so my gains are not your losses. So actually, it shouldn't happen, right? We shouldn't be bullying each other because it serves no purpose. And collectively as a society, we're stronger together. So I've always found it quite backwards at sort of tearing each other down for any benefit, perceived or not. But that's an idealistic viewpoint. Now, look, shifting gears, because we mentioned about the consultation that's underway, and I really want to touch on that. I want to sort of grab some thoughts about that. So we know it's currently the government's currently launched a safeguarding review. Janet, why is this happening, and what do you expect to come out of this?
Okay, well, I think safeguarding is a topic that always needs to be on top of everyone's agenda. So it's no surprise that this is happening, and it shouldn't be. And I think it's making sure that it remains at the top of the agenda, and that the training and induction and instilling some sort of routine aspect to the safeguarding element, making sure that safeguarding, and online in particular, online safety, is sort of driving this a little bit in terms of the way that online learning has taken place, but also the fact that, you know, it's use of online, whether it's inside the school environment or outside, it's that perhaps has got the most danger in terms of safeguarding for staff. And when we think of newly qualified staff, when we think about learning mentors, anybody that can actually that's working with children in that space, they need to be aware of the dangers, and be able to recognize them. So there's a strong element of frequent updating. There's a strong element of responsibility during that training, and for safeguarding, and especially for online safety, to take a more prominent role, I think, in that. So keeping children safe in education is much broader than it used to be, because it's got to capture all of this online. And, you know, going back to what you were both talking about there, absolutely, we're never going to have that sort of utopian society, are we, where everybody is kind to each other, because it's our feelings that control just how kind we want to be at any particular moment. And that's, you know, that's acceptable. But the idea of actually thinking it's okay to call somebody, or to use an online media, or any kind of media, to, whether that's the spoken word or the written word, or pictures or anything, has got to be something that's out there, that's spoken about, and that the teachers are more informed and more alert of the changes in behaviour and in disposition, and also peers looking after each other and creating that community. Because what happens with the online and the grooming and so on, you tend to be tuned in, don't you? If it was they'd be talking to you, they wouldn't be talking to a group of you, which sometimes can happen when you're in the out in the playground, for example. They're talking to you, they're talking to one person, and sometimes it's almost like receiving a letter that is abusive. You'll read it over and over and over again, and then of course your mood changes with it. So I think that escalation of online safety and the dangers, and the subsequent consequences of that for children and young people's holistic health and well-being is paramount, and that's a reason behind this consultation, and about broadening that's keeping children safe in education, and also in making sure that there's information in there, not only for staff, but also for people, for governing bodies, for parents, for carers, but significantly for the children and young people themselves. So a more accessible range of resources that will go alongside that initial guidance, and I think that can only be a good thing.
Absolutely. Are you expecting much from a technology perspective, Richard, to come out, or is this perceived to be more of the mental health element?
Yeah, I think it's primarily going to be that. It's primarily going to be a kind of mental health element. That doesn't mean to say, however, that there aren't technologies available or technologies that couldn't be developed, that come out of that kind of consultation. I think there'll always be a desire to solve these problems technologically. You know, that's what draws a lot of people into the world of IT and wanting to do development, is that, you know, they see problems that they want to solve, and they think technology is the right way to solve them. So I have no doubt that there will be solutions that are put forward and are developed. But I think there definitely has to be a drive from that initial kind of having that conversation. And I think that's the important step, is like making it very clear and having those open and honest conversations around why it's important to have this, and why it's important to do those things, which then allow those technology solutions to come into play.
Excellent. Yeah, good point. Um, For building on the report again, Janet, obviously that we're expecting some changes, we're expecting some guidance. What presumably the guidance comes, obviously we'll update as far as our safeguarding quals go, if needed, if we're not already covering it, etc., etc. Can you tell us a little bit more? What are those quals that we have? What are those products that we have available for customers at the moment? And what are they specifically doing, maybe around the cyber element?
Okay, I am going to talk about two in particular, but before I do that, and I will refer to my notes to make sure I get it right for you on that one. But generally speaking, there's an element of safeguarding in most qualifications, especially those qualifications that are about the children and young people element. So early years qualifications, health and social care qualifications, those kind of vocational led. There is always an element of safeguarding, and online safety is always key to that. But it's not sort of the focus by any means, and neither should it be. We don't want safeguarding to be a dominance of the qualifications that we offer, but it's critically important, but it shouldn't dominate, because we've got to give this holistic sort of overview. However, here come the notes. So there are a couple of qualifications that I think speak more to the online safety element, and one that is very general is a level 1 award in safeguarding in a learning environment. And it's level 1, but the scope of that and how it actually empowers, or could potentially empower, staff as CPD, because of what it covers at a certain depth, and that's enough to give you a little bit of breadth if you haven't got it, but also something that can be used, as I've spoken about infinitum about this pastoral side of things, weaving something in to a curriculum where there is no formal digital learning apart from digital use. Why aren't we learning about it as a subject area, to an extent? So at level 1, you're giving those tools to people to be able to make more informed decisions, and to open up the kind of discussions that Richard was talking about. So staying safe online in a learning environment is one of the units within that. So that's pretty self-explanatory. It identifies the need to stay safe while studying online, and addresses key issues of internet privacy, confidentiality, data protection, freedom of information, and guidelines in a learning environment. So again, it's got that breadth. And then there's a unit that looks specifically at investigating cyberbullying in a learning environment, and this raises an awareness of those dangers associated with cyberbullying, and addresses many issues surrounding that, and maybe ways to help to prevent it, or at least raise an awareness of it. And then you can get better at preventing it. And then there's the qualification that comes to mind that is specifically, and I couldn't get away without not doing that, my colleagues would not let me, but there is a level 1 award that's about understanding safeguarding in education and childcare settings. So one that is, predominantly for early years staff, that's looking at the way that you can encourage young children to stay safe. So potential risks associated with technology, social media, online bullying, that sort of thing, the things we've talked about during this webinar, and identifying features of healthy relationships, both online and offline. So taking it, and shifting it, and just saying, where do we want to be? What is a safe environment? Why can't online safety contribute to that, instead of assuming that it doesn't? How can we twist this around? And that's that cultural shift that Richard was talking about as well. So looking at the potential risks for children, for young people, for the learners, and for their families, really important. And young people that are doing these sorts of qualifications are the very people that are enjoying the freedoms of technology, and that is to be celebrated, but they're also the people that are falling foul of it as well. So we need to try and address both things simultaneously, and accept and appreciate that, digital innovation is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Look at how far we're going. The possibilities are impossible to imagine, and yet we are continually trying to monitor, to filter, and that's a lack of education. It's a lack of knowledge, so we need to tie those two up somehow. But yes, a couple of qualifications there to think about.
Excellent, brilliant, thanks very much. Right, Richard, final question, short burst. You got your proverbial magic wand. What do you either take, away or add into the environment that makes people safer online? You
Oh
could do
wow.
anything.
Okay.
You can't just take away bullies.
Really?
Yeah. I mean,
That's a shame.
that would be great, but that's not.
That would have made my answer much easier, wouldn't it? If I
Yeah.
could have said that. I think for me, it's the biggest thing we can do to kind of help people is to put front and center the control for someone who utilizes these platforms to be able to give them an environment that's like safe and works for them. So rather than having this concept of these controls being hidden away to some extent, I don't want to be too uncharitable around that, but rather than them being an afterthought or something that you need to go looking for, it's something that's presented to someone to start with, and really helps them to understand what elements of control they've got over the environment they're interacting with.
Love it. So let's safety first.
Yeah, definitely.
Brilliant. Janet, same question.
Oh, if I was given a magic wand, I think there's an element of being kind and kindness that is in any classroom environment. I think there are definitely more dangers online because there's so much unknown, and I think I'd just like to see, if it was a real magic wand, that element of kindness and well-being, which I think 99% of people anyway have got. I'd like to see that actually being expanded into the online digital world, because the only reason, or to a point, the only reason that exists is because we say it can. Just like the trolls have said, because I can. Oh, we do it because we can, and we assume it's going to happen because it does. So I think it's about that cultural shift, and empowering young people and anybody, never mind young people, anybody using using technology to be mindful of do as you would be done by. It goes back to that, I think.
Brilliant.
That's my magic wand.
No, I love it. That's a perfect answer. Richard, Janet, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today about this. I think in summary, it's fair to say that the landscape is evolving, and I, for one, am absolutely really excited about that. But I think we have a duty to protect those around us, especially those in our care. So I think I feel like lots have been done. We've made significant strides in key areas, but I think we have to acknowledge that there's still much to be done. Some of the areas we've touched on today will be useful to those listening. And if you have any tips that you'd like to share with us and the wider audience, you can use #CallItOut to share your thoughts. But thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.